Alright, I'm at Ava, which is a railway station you've probably not heard of. This is episode 4 of Before the Big Boy up on the Union Pacific. And in 1955, this route here became the first route in New Zealand to be entirely steam-free, a combination of electric and diesel electrics from the old country. That transition was occurring all around the railroad world, including in our subject photograph. And today we're looking at the FTT class, as it was known on the Union Pacific. All right, let's get into it. Alco built the 3-cylinder 410-2s for both the Union Pacific and the Southern Pacific. On the Southern Pacific, the road named them after themselves, entirely their right. The Union Pacific called them the Overland. FTT class, Overland type. That was a reference to their corporate motto at the time and a reference to where the Transcontinental Railroad sat on the history of the wagon trails that preceded it. The 3-cylinder type form a small, important and interesting period in locomotive development in North America, and their story is bookended by the TTT class that preceded it on the Union Pacific, for example, and either the Great Depression or the Challenger types that came after them, depending on how you look at it. Received wisdom when it comes to 3-cylinder locomotives is that they are a maintenance nightmare, and there's some truth to that. All of the lubrication tasks on that central big end bearing need to be conducted between the wheels and between the frames. You'll notice on the photographs that there's a greater gap between the first and second drivers on the FTT when compared to the gaps further down the rigid wheelbase and compared to the consistently short gaps on the TTT type. This was to allow the center cylinder to peak over the top of the leading axle, but it must also have been there to provide more wriggle room for the poor sod that has to snake his way in there to lubricate that massive big end bearing. A bearing which, if it overheats, will lead to catastrophic failure. So that's one part of the maintenance nightmare, because if it does catastrophically fail, it would be an exceedingly difficult task to replace it. The other maintenance problem is with the Gresley conjugated valve system that provided the valve movements for the center cylinder. The connections tended to wear, and if they wore out, or when they wore out, it affected the timing. And that change in timing means that the center cylinder is coming into full power earlier than intended, taking a greater amount of strain, putting a greater amount of strain on that big end bearing, for instance. That problem ultimately was rectified in 3 ways. One, get rid of the center cylinder, which is in fact what they did on the FTT in 1942. The other, replace the connections with roller bearings, thus easing the wear, thus keeping the timing more pure. The third was to adopt a variation to the outside Walschaerts valve gear and take motion off of the eccentric rod, but that's a story for another episode. So there's some examples of the quote-unquote maintenance nightmare of a 3-cylinder locomotive. Yet the 3-cylinder locomotives did last until the end of steam on the Southern Pacific and on the Union Pacific, because the big 9s retained their 3-cylinder format to the end of steam. But those maintenance issues do beg the question of why go to all that trouble in the first place. And to answer that, we need to revert back an episode to the concept of hauling more faster, because the FTT, for instance, had the following advantages over its preceding TTT type. And if we remember the weaknesses of the TTT type, the first is moving all that steam. Well, now instead of having 2 big cylinders, you've got 3 smaller cylinders, therefore easier task for the valve systems on those 3 cylinders to move the steam in and out. So that gets rid of that dampening effect, which limits high-speed running on the TTTs. We also have a separated drive. The center cylinder drives the number 2 axle. The outside cylinders drive the center or number 3 axle. So that confluence of center of yaw and center of gravity is avoided in the FTT. That again means higher road speeds are achievable. The other advantage is to do with counterbalancing on the driving wheels. Because the tractive effort is now split by 3 instead of 2, there's much more scope to counterbalance the driving wheels to allow them to do high-speed rotation. The last advantage of the 410-2 over the 210-2 came about because the 3 smaller cylinders weigh a hell of a lot more than 2 larger cylinders. So the type needed the 4 leading wheels up front that had the advantage of assisting with tracking, which had the advantage of assisting with high-speed running. The hauling more side of it is that 3 smaller cylinders produce more tractive effort than 2 larger cylinders. And in our worked example, TTT to FTT, it's something like an 11% increase in tractive effort. So you combine that increase in tractive effort, raw pulling power, with an increase in the ability to run at speed, and you're achieving hauling more faster. By now, you would have realized that a lot of the photographs I'm showing you are of the Southern Pacific type. That is because Otto Perry, who took 20,000 photos, only managed to take 4 of the Overland FTT. Overland suggests that that type was intended to work on the transcontinental. They ended up working on the Salt Lake route. I'm unsure of how wide a domain they had on that route. There were only a handful of locomotives in the first place. But that was their domain up until steam was done away with. And I think I read somewhere that on the Union Pacific, the Salt Lake route was the first, like this line here, the first to do away with steam traction. And that's probably for no other reason than the fact that it's an exceedingly arid part of North America, and the easiest way to provide water to steam locomotives in an arid region is to do away with steam locomotives. They ended up on the Sherman Hill banking service, as evidenced by our subject photo. Now, the reality in North America, at least, is that there were really only a handful of 3-cylinder locomotives. And for big, high-end hauling power locomotives, we're really only talking about the Southern Pacifics, the Overland, and the succeeding class, the Union Pacific, the big 9s. And so looking back, the easy question to ask is, why didn't they just go to 4-cylinder articulateds? They didn't because they couldn't, because the problems that prevented 4-cylinder articulators running at high speed had not yet been shown to be properly addressed. And we'll look at that more completely in the upcoming episode on the challenges. The other answer to that question is maintenance issues aside, and maintenance issues tend to get figured out as locomotives remain in service. The big 9s and the Southern Pacific types did their job as intended through the entirety of their career, a career that only came to an end at the end of steam. The FTTs were, as I've already said, converted to 2-cylinder format, and it might be that when you've got a handful of locomotives, there's just not enough incentive for the maintenance personnel to invest deeply into mastering the maintenance skills, whereas with the Union Pacific types, there are damn near 100, and that is a number And when you've got a greater number of locomotives, it's harder to push them to the back of the workshop and say, we'll get onto it next week. So that's it. That's the consideration of the 3-cylinder type as it appeared in the 410 two-wheel arrangement. There are only ever 3 examples in North America. 2 I've already discussed. One was a weird hybrid example built by Baldwin for which they could not find any buyers. An exceedingly complex beast by comparison with the FTT or the SPs. And that locomotive is an aside that played no role at all in the development of North American motive power. And it certainly doesn't feature in our subject photograph. In the next episode, we move one more locomotive away from the photographer and we have a look at the truly impressive Union Pacific Big 9s. All right, like, subscribe, enjoy. It's a beautiful day. Might go for a ride in a train. Cheers.